Following the end of the Second World War, when the guns had just barely cooled, a new spark was lit. This time, it was silent and much, much colder. Hey, what's up guys? My name is Rheza. I'm from LB66, International Relations of Bina Nusantara University, and I'm here today as part of my English for Business presentation class to present to you the Cold War. Right, let's get started. So first, the term Cold War was coined by George Orwell in his book, The Animal Farm, to describe the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite the name though, the Cold War was not a direct conflict between nations. That still does not stop the entire thing to claim billions of lives and hundreds of thousands of dollars though. Okay, let's start from the very beginning. Following the official surrender of Nazi Germany at the conclusion of the Second World War, the uneasy wartime alliance between the United States, the Great Britain, and Soviet Union began to deteriorate and ultimately breaks apart. Soviet Union, under the then President Joseph Stalin, seeks to expand and claim the states on its borders, such as Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, and later install communist regime there. But things were never that simple. See, the Americans were firmly against communism, and they are not having any of this. United States adopted the containment policy against Soviet and the spread of communism, and it remained as its foreign policy for the duration of the Cold War. Following that, in 1947, the Truman Doctrine was born and adopted. If you are curious about it, it basically says that the United States should give their support to those threatened by the spread of communism. To further help their effort to contain the spread of communist influence, U.S. Secretary George D. Marshall launched a huge financial support plan to Europe, called the Marshall Plan. $13 billion were spent in 1948 to 1951, helping to reconstruct much of the shambles that was Western Europe. Surprisingly, the United States was ready to provide their help even to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe. Unsurprisingly, it was rejected. 1948 came around, and Britain, France, and United States were just about ready to unify post-war Germany back into a single unified country. But surprise, surprise, the Soviet didn't quite like the idea of Germany getting back any of their former power. So they decided to close all access to Berlin with a blockade with the hopes of either forcing the Western Alliance to surrender Berlin to the communists or stop the unification plan altogether. Again, things was not so simple. They achieved absolutely nothing, as the then President of the United States, Harry Truman, decided to deliver the supplies via aircrafts to the residents of West Berlin. So for the next years or so, thousands of American aircrafts began flying all over Berlin to deliver food, medicine, and emergency supplies to the residents there. Another year passed, and 1949 kicked off with Berlin blockade getting lifted by the Soviet Union. After all, not only did they fail convincing the Western powers to surrender Berlin, Western powers also signed the North Atlantic Treaty. Basically, it translates to, if you attack one of us, you attack all of us, and you should expect serious retaliation. And then NATO, the organization for the members of the North Atlantic Treaty, was formed the following year to merge the military forces of the member states. In response to this, Soviet Union made their own version of the North Atlantic Treaty in 1955, called the Warsaw Pact. Right, back to the year 1949. The communists managed to rise in power in China, and the United States finally committed to fight communism in Asia. Meanwhile, in 1950, pro-Soviet North Korean army invaded South Korea. This marks the first military action taken in the Cold War so far. United States joined the war under South Korea's behalf, and after some back and forth exchange that ultimately led to nothing but many more names etched to the stone, the officials began to frantically work out some sort of armistice with the North Koreans in fear of kickstarting the Third World War. In 1953, the Korean War finally came to an end, and the two sides of Korea remain divided to this day. While all of this is happening, Across the globe, back in the mainland, citizens of United States was caught in the hysteria over the perceived threat of communism in the US, aptly called the Red Scare. It was honestly amazing what people could do when they feel threatened, as President Harry Truman called for the loyalty order among the government officials, interrogating his employees for questionable activities that could mark them as communists. Industries, even the big ones like Hollywood, began blacklisting people suspected of communism, and some, like the politician Joseph McCarthy, used it to his advantage by pointing names and calling them communists. Moving on 1 year later, at the late 1950s, we saw the outer space as the new battlefield between the United States and the Soviet. It became a match between the two superpowers to prove superiority in terms of economy, politics, technology, and military strength by shooting objects and people into space. Again, flash forward to 1961. The United States oversaw the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by American-trained Cubans who fled their homes when Fidel Castro took over. The invasion failed as the invading force was hopelessly outnumbered by Castro's forces, and they surrendered after less than 24 hours of fighting. So, a little backstory here. Back in the day, leadership of Cuba was taken over by this revolutionary called Fidel Castro. He sort of gave the middle finger to the US government, and he began opening contact with East Soviet. The US government took, well, they don't like it, and yeah, the invasion happened. Meanwhile, following the failed blockade of Berlin by Soviet, the leaders of East Germany decided to put a wall between the conspicuously capitalist West Berlin and East Berlin to, quote, stop the spread of Western fascism and undermining the Eastern government, unquote. When in truth, the Berlin Wall was erected to prevent defection from Soviet-controlled East Berlin to the United States-controlled West Berlin, which is more economically stable and rich. The war goes on, and both nations kept going with their arms race. For your information, an arms race is a rapid increase in the quantity or quality of instruments of military power between two rival states in peacetime. To be sure, this wasn't the first time an arms race happened, but the simple fact that the United States and the Soviet Union was dealing with nuclear weapons raised the stake infinitely higher than any arms race before it. Testing of missiles had been done by the two superpowers since 1950 as a show of power to intimidate one another. This contest came to a head with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Arguably, this is the closest we have ever gotten to the Third World War. Following the failed invasion of Cuba at 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made agreements with Fidel Castro to plant Soviet missiles in Cuba to deter any further aggression from the United States. And so, Soviet began to send anti-aircraft missiles to Cuba. This would have been fine if a US U-2 spy plane hadn't caught photos of nuclear missiles on construction in Cuba. President George F. Kennedy gathered a special team called XCOM in response to the threat. The first solution, as you may have thought, was to bomb Cuba to dust. Luckily, Kennedy rejected the idea, and a new course of action was made: a naval quarantine of Cuba. Kennedy proceeded to send a letter to Khrushchev stating that the US would not permit any further offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba, and whatever weapon already there to be dismantled and sent back to the USSR as soon as possible. He even went so far so as to go on national television so to inform the citizens of the crisis. This and that happened, and the world managed to somehow dodge the threat of total nuclear war on October 1962. After agreements managed to be made between the United States and the Soviet Union, with the removal of the missiles in Cuba and the Jupiter missile from Turkey within 6 months. A year later, in 1963, a hotline was successfully set between the two leaders to create the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and later, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was officially signed, meaning the superpowers promised not to supply nuclear weapons to other countries for proxy war. Flash forward to 1989, when the Cold War began to thaw across Eastern Europe. East Berlin officials finally announced that starting midnight that day, citizens are free to cross the country's border. East and West Berliners flocked to the wall, some climbing over and others brought hammers and picks to knock over the wall down. Soon the wall was gone, and Berlin was united once more. The unification was made official a year later, in 1990. During the 1960s to 1970s, the Communist Party elite rapidly gained wealth while millions of average citizens faced poverty and starvation in Eastern Europe. This caused heavy backlash, as the younger generations refused to adopt communism as their parents had. Adding to that, foreign attacks on Soviet economy, the failed reformations, and the political revolutions across Eastern Europe began to tear USSR apart piece by piece. Finally, on December 1991, the USSR dissolved and ceased to exist. Okay, so that's it guys. 10 minutes of Cold War with me. Thank you for your attention, and I hope my video helped you with learning about Cold War and its histories. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.